through Job chapter 2, verse 10. There was a man in the country of Uz named Job. He was a man of complete integrity who feared God and turned away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. His estate included 7,000 sheep and goats, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large number of servants. Job was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His sons used to take turns having banquets at their homes. They would send an invitation to their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. Whenever a round of banqueting was over, Job would send for his children and purify them, rising early in the morning to offer burnt offerings for them. For Job thought, "Perhaps my children have sinned, having cursed God in their hearts." This was Job's regular practice. One day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord asked Satan, "Where have you come from?" "From roaming the earth," Satan answered him, "and walking around on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil." Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and everything he owns? Have you blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land? But stretch out your hand and strike everything he owns, and he will surely curse you to your face." "Very well," the Lord told Satan, "everything he owns is in your power. However, do not lay a hand on Job himself." So Satan left the presence of the Lord. One day when Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and reported, "While the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, the Subians swooped down and took them away. They struck down the servants with their sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." He was still speaking when another messenger came and reported, "God's fire fell from heaven. It burned the sheep and the servants and devoured them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." The messenger was still speaking when yet another came and reported, "The Chaldeans formed 3 bands, made a raid on the camels, and took them away. They struck down the servants with the sword, and I alone escaped to tell you." He was still speaking when another messenger came and reported, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. Suddenly a powerful wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on the young people so that they died, and I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Job stood up, tore his robe, and shaved his head. He fell to the ground and worshipped, saying, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will leave this life. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Throughout all this, Job did not sin or blame God for anything. One day, the sons of God came again to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord asked Satan, "Where have you come from?" "From roaming through the earth," Satan answered him, "and walking around on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil. He still retains his integrity, even though you incited me against him to destroy him for no good reason." "Skin for skin," Satan answered the Lord. "A man will give up everything he owns in exchange for his life. But stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." "Very well," the Lord told Satan. "He is in your power. Only spare his life." So Satan left the Lord's presence and infected Job with terrible boils from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery to scrape himself while he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." "You speak as a foolish woman speaks," he told her. Should we accept only good things and not adversity? Throughout all this, Job did not sin in what he said.
Hi, I'm Phil, one of the pastors here at Christ Fellowship Eastside, and this week we began our study on the book of Job, and we are diving into this fascinating story about an incredible man that I hope will be a life-changing experience for all of us. I don't know if we got some extra mics on this morning or something along those lines. And I feel like, this is one of those books that no matter where you're in life and what you're going through, it's one of those books that we all need. And so I'm going to encourage all of you, we're going to take 6 weeks to kind of dip our toes into some key points in this book, but we don't have time to go through the entire book. So I'm going to encourage you to pick up this book in your leisure time and read it through so you'll have a little bit broader context of the passages that we're going to be looking at throughout the series. We'll try to give a little context as we go, but I hope that it'll be a blessing for you to spend here kind of wrapping around the Easter time frame, looking at this life of suffering. And I think that in a number of ways, this book actually leads us toward Easter. And I'm going to give a little hat tip toward that at the end, and you're going to see those little sprinklings of the Easter story wrapped into the book of Job as it kind of brings us all the way to those couple weeks where we're going to take a break from this series and look at Easter. I say that all of us need to be grounded in the message of the book of Job because in a lot of ways, we all experience kinds of suffering that come into our lives. And I just think about my own experience in my own life. I don't necessarily consider myself as somebody who's suffered in extraordinary ways, but at the same time, it doesn't take much time. I sat down for about 5 minutes and tried to think about what are some key moments of suffering that has crept into my life over the years. And as a child, I can recall the very first funeral I went to was for a woman named Miss Ruth, who was my Sunday school teacher at the church. And I would have probably been about 6 years old or so. And I remember my parents bringing me past the open casket. And I just remember seeing her cold and lifeless body. And just suddenly, like, all these feelings came over me that I had never felt before. And it was so impactful for me. I had a little Bible as a kid, and I wrote that date in the very front of the Bible as just this memorable day for me. And then the next date that showed up in the front of my Bible was as a little older. I think I was probably about 10, and there was a teenage boy that lived right next door to us, and he would play with us and do different things together. And he had fallen in with the wrong crowd, and they were hanging out. He was, I think, 17 at the time, and there was some fight that took place over a girl, and the other guy took a gun and killed him. And I remember going to that one, a closed casket funeral, and watching his parents, who I knew well, grieving over the loss of their son and trying to figure out how they were going to move forward as a family together. So that date went in the front of my Bible. A few years later, my older brother's classmate died while trying to bench press without a spotter. Even later on, just a number of events in my preteen childhood that left me with deep wounds. My life, my family impacted by it. Stuff that if I were to tell you about it, I'd have to give you a trigger warning beforehand. As a teenager, my closest friend and mentor went in for a routine knee replacement surgery. He was an older guy. That went sideways. And a month later, he ended up hospitalized for a long stint with an infection that had basically eaten away at the bones in his leg to the point that that knee could not be restored. And he walked with a walker for the rest of his life. He died at 62 years old. Complications of the infection were part of the cause of that. As a young adult, I remember attending a church where there was a young girl who was diagnosed with a terminal disease. And every Sunday, we would see her there with her family, an incurable condition, and they would show up Sunday after Sunday, and each week, everyone knew that we were inching 1 week closer to the day that she would no longer be with us. And watching her parents suffer through that path, and eventually that inevitable week came. And it didn't take away any of the gravity and the heaviness of the loss. Or even on a different note, around the time Laurel and I got married, We were trying to set ourselves up well for marriage, and one of the steps I took was to pursue an investment property that had okay margins. It wasn't amazing margins, but it was enough that it would have ended us launching into marriage debt-free and with a little bit of money in the bank. That year was 2008. That did not happen. We ended up going into marriage with over $10,000 of debt, a lot of it on high-interest credit cards that were supposed to be temporary. And so that did not go so well for us out of the gate. You may look at some of that and say, well, I've suffered way more than that. The reality is, just on a short recounting, we all have stuff that we've been through. We've all been through these painful moments of life that become defining for us in critical ways. Things that shape the trajectory of our lives and the decisions we make and the things that we do with our lives, the careers and the people that we marry. It just doesn't take much to look back at the suffering and see the impact that it's made. But yet at the same time, it's easy to look at the suffering that we see in life and in some ways connect it to what we see here in the book of Job, in the sense that it almost seems sometimes entirely pointless. You look at certain moments of suffering and you say, well, that person didn't necessarily grow closer to God. They didn't necessarily become stronger as a result from that. I just sometimes see suffering that comes in. It just doesn't make sense. I don't have a real clear grasp of why that had to happen in that person's life. In the book of Job, I think that's why it's so important to us, because it gives us a story of when suffering doesn't make sense. You realize we get the narrative story of the rest of this. We get the explanation of what's going on behind the closed doors of heaven. We get the explanation of what God was doing on the back end of the suffering. Job doesn't get that. Job doesn't know. And neither do we when unexplained suffering enters into our lives. I think, just looking at this book, it's really an incredible book. I mean, you don't find stuff like this in ancient literature. You don't find stuff like this in other world religions. You don't find things like this in ancient mythology, where something like this is just so incredibly real. This is the life that we live. This is the suffering that comes into our lives. So it's meant to then reshape how we encounter suffering and reshape how we address suffering. So in this passage, we're going to see why Job suffered. We're going to see who made Job suffer, and then we're going to see how Job suffered. We're going to look at the why, the who, and the how. So first, why Job suffered. This passage starts off by telling us a lot just in those first 3 verses. He says he was a man of complete integrity who feared God, turned away from evil. It gives those kind of characteristics of the man himself. And we see that, in his life and in the description of how he lived his life. You can see a man that is marked by complete devotion to God. You can see the love that he has toward his children. His passion that they walk with God. And you can even see aspects of the care that he extends to the community at large. This is a good man. And so then why is it that such a good man is the guy that's known as this guy who just suffered in a really incredible and extreme way? That's how Job is associated in the cultural mindset. But yet he was this amazingly good man. Well, the crux of it really comes down to verses 9 through 11. The gist of why Job suffered comes out here. It says, Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and everything he owns? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he owns, and he will surely curse you to your face." Do you see what Satan is asserting here in these verses? He's asserting Job only follows you because he gets good stuff from you. Job only has devotion for you because you bless him in his life. If you take that away, he won't follow you. Job doesn't really love you. He's only after what you can give him. He's only trying to use you. He's only trying to manipulate you. Don't you see? And there in that moment, we see something that, whether we think about it or not, that accusation of Job should haunt every one of us who claims to follow God. Do I follow God just because he takes care of my life? Just because he gives me nice stuff? Just because I have a house to live in and clothes on my back and food to eat? Is that why I follow God? Do I follow God because let's spiritualize it. I have salvation. I have the church I'm a part of. Isn't that wonderful? Do I follow God because I have all this stuff? Or do I follow God because of God himself and my love and passion and devotion for him? That's a haunting question. You may say, well, that feels a little too like introspective and deep, and you're turning over a lot of rocks to kind of get there. That just, you're way too in your head about this. But I would push back and say, actually, that defining question is the kickoff for the book of Job. It's so important that question be resolved that God says, you know what? I think it's the one place on all of Scripture that God and Satan agree. God essentially is saying, okay, that is an important question to resolve. Let's resolve that. Let's resolve that question. Because how do we know whether we worship God just for his blessings or whether we worship God out of true devotion and love for him? It's the same way that we know who our true friends are. We all have good friends when you're doing nice things for them, when you're having them over to the party, when you're making nice cheesecakes for them and those kinds of things. Everybody wants to be your friend. I'm not going to give away who that is. But when you're not able to throw the parties, when you're not able to make the nice goodies and all that, are they still your friends? I talk through with young folks who are navigating dating and engagement and all these things, and there's kind of this pressure of, the sexual, physical side of the relationship. Does he still love you if you say no? Or is he going to walk out? See, we all see that pressure of, am I being used or am I loved for who I am? Am I being manipulated? We know that, and we know what it means when all those things are stripped away and they still love you just the same. They're still there, as the marriage vows say, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live. There is something real about that kind of a relationship. We know what it is because we know what it isn't. And that's what goes on in the life of Job, is the only way that question can really be answered, the only way that question of Satan can really be put to rest is if everything Job has is stripped away. All the good stuff that God has put into his life has to be taken away in order to answer that question. Does he love you for yourself or does he love you for your stuff? It's an important question. And it's something that Job is left eventually with nothing. And so then he's left with God alone to either embrace or eviscerate. And so that moves us then to the next question. Who made Job suffer? Now this is where we get into that complex territory of, what causes suffering? Where does suffering and evil in the world come from? And how does that relate to how we think about God and what the Bible says about God? And there are a number of different ways that people have approached this over time. And some people would say, well, maybe God is a good kind of grandfatherly being in the sky, but he's not great enough. He's not powerful enough to stop the evil that comes into the world. And so, and there's that sense of, maybe it's this, the light side and the dark side. They're kind of just balanced and equal, the yin and the yang, and they're kind of duking it out in the skies. And, we'll just see. Hopefully good will come out in the end. And there's kind of this, God is truly good, but he's kind of pitted up against some greater evil force or great evil force that's balanced. On the other hand, some will say, well, God is clearly great and all-powerful, can do anything he wants, but maybe he's not good. Maybe he doesn't really care to eliminate the evil in the world. Maybe Maybe there is some malevolent force in God himself. Or maybe there's no God at all. And just suffering is just an inevitable part of life. It's just part of the chemistry of the universe, part of the evolutionary process. It's just suffering. It's pain everywhere you see. People are just meant to devour each other and be evil to each other. But the book of Job shows us a different path that kind of cuts through all of this. It shows us that God has this really complicated relationship with suffering that defies a lot of our simplistic explanations, our little pat answers and our easy ways to explain this. That there really is a good and great God who comes into the suffering of our life and engages with it in a complex way. And we'll look at kind of three marks of the complicated relationship that God has with suffering. Number one, God restrains suffering. It says, in relation to Job's life up to this point, it says that God had placed a hedge on him. Even when he's giving Job kind of over to Satan, in a sense, he says that do not lay a hand on his body. You can't take his life. He puts a limit. He draws a line in the sand and says, you can't do that. You can't bring that kind of suffering on him. In every way, the hand of God remains holding back the surge of suffering in the world. I think of it, I saw a video that was kind of going around of a hurricane that was sweeping into a city, and the storm surge was building and coming up through the streets of the town, and it began to press up against a particular hotel that had these big glass doors, and you could see all the workers in the hotel huddled up against the doors, trying to hold those doors from swinging open and letting the floodwaters pour into the hotel. And it just kind of gave me that mental image of, this is what God is effectively doing against the storm surge of suffering that we have unleashed upon our world. Our first parents opened a door that could not be shut by their own power. They opened a door to evil. They opened a door to death. They opened a door to destruction and suffering in our world. And so it marked their lives, their children's lives, their children's children's lives, and so on, all down the generations. We have done something to our world that has not been undone. We have opened Pandora's box. We have opened the portals to the Chitauri who are breaking in. And there is nothing that can be done to stop that from overwhelming where we live unless God acts. And there is this sense in which God himself restrains all the suffering that should be coming into the world. And not only restrains it and keeps it at bay, keeps those portals closed for the most part, but also spreads out some of his goodness and some of his blessing into the world. And so I would suggest we need to, just humbly here, reframe the question. The question is often put, how can a good and great God exist if there's so much suffering in the world? And I would flip that a little bit and say, well, how can there be so much good in a world in which suffering has been unleashed if there isn't a good and great God? How can there be so much good in the world when suffering should be overwhelming the planet, where poverty, famine, disease should be everywhere, but God holds it back and showers us with his goodness? This is the God who restrains suffering. There's also the reality that God releases the suffering. He tells Satan, Job is now in your power. Take it out on him. And that feels rather disturbing. God here is actively releasing this suffering into the life of Job. Yes, God limits the extent of it, but he does send the suffering that puts Job to his knees. I had a good conversation with a brother this past week. He just said, I know you kind of have a very high view of God's sovereignty, and it feels like it's very easy to draw this line where you make God the author, the creator of evil. That God is the one doing the suffering, causing the suffering himself. How do you have a good, all-powerful, sovereign God and not have him creating the suffering that comes into your life? And I would just give us a category for this to help us understand those moments when God does let his hands back from the tide of suffering and lets that come into our lives. There's a category for that I would put in front of you. It's what early church father Augustine referred to as the privation of good. And by that, privation is like deprivation. So there's a sense that God made everything in the book of Genesis. He says he made everything good. When he analyzes everything that he creates, he says, that's good. He looks over at the plants and the animals. He says, that's good. He looks at the sun, the moon, the stars. That's good. So everything God creates, God created good. But with the things that God creates, the good things that God makes, there is the possibility for them to be warped and twisted and turned, taken away from, subtracted, turned into a negative, and used in ways that are dark. Think of it this way. Yes, there is the reality that we can enjoy life eating good food with full bellies. But in order for us to be able to enjoy that, there has to be a reality where we cannot have that. We can have nice ideas of things that we learn as we discover this wonderful, good universe that God has made. But there's also the possibility that certain people can be inhibited from being able to learn and educate themselves and to be able to have access to education. If homes can be built, homes can be destroyed. Sex is wonderful in the selfless union of husband and wife, but it can be warped and twisted into something selfish and ugly in other spaces. Bodies can be healthy and strong, but by inverse, if they can be that, they can also be weakened and can fall apart. You can see how God created everything to be good, but there is a principle by which everything that can be good can be deprived of that good. God did not create the deprivation. God created the good thing. All of the evil that we see, all the suffering in the world is the deprivation, the taking away of the good thing that God has given us in the world. And in some ways, God has chosen here in the life of Job to send suffering through the hands of Satan to inflict that suffering on Job, to deprive some of that goodness that God created on earth. Still leaves us asking some questions about why. Why would God do that? And in some ways, it's good that we leave ourselves hanging a bit with the questions. I'm not going to be able to dismiss all the questions. I can tell you the story of Job and what's going on to give you pieces of the puzzle. But I can't put together all the pieces of the puzzle of suffering this morning for you. But I will say this. God also repurposes the suffering that comes into the heart and life of Job. What do I mean by it? God says, very well, do it. Go take suffering and put it into the life of Job, because I've got to get him to the point where verses 9 through 11, that question is resolved for him. But in that moment, Satan has a very particular goal for the suffering that's coming into the life of Job. Satan has the goal in that moment to see Job curse God, to see Job's life completely destroyed, to see him walk away from God. But in that very same suffering, God has a purpose. God has a direction for that suffering. He is repurposing what Satan would use as a tool to his own ends and saying, I have a different plan for that. And in fact, we know that God knows the beginning from the end. God knows exactly where Job is going to end up. And so he's taking Job down a path that's going to lead him in a very particular direction, even though Satan has a completely different goal in mind. Your suffering that comes into your life is not guaranteed to bring you closer to God. That guarantee does not exist. Suffering has the possibility to bring you closer to God, but it also has the possibility to lead you further away, to expose what we really are. And that's what Satan's effectively doing. He said, let me expose Job for the fraud he really is. He doesn't really love you. He just loves the good stuff he gets from you. But God knows when the suffering comes in, it's going to expose him, for what he really is, a true follower. Yes, he's not perfect, and he's going to struggle, and we're going to see that in some of these chapters. God is going to say, like, you haven't nailed it entirely, but here, at least at the outset, it seems like Job passes the test. Job proves Satan wrong. Job proves God's purpose was correct in his life. I also want to give us some pieces here of how Job suffers. There are all these things that are happening that are often where our minds run when we're going through times of suffering. We're asking the why question. We're running to all the bigger picture things of what's going on there. Yeah, it's just really helpful for us to even just see, like, how does Job process the suffering that comes into his life? Here's a guy who just runs headlong into suffering. And he is, you can just see him just deeply moved by this. It said, verse 20, then Job stood up and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell to the ground in worship. I've seen a lot of people process pain in their lives. People go through really terrible situations. I will say, and maybe this is modern Western culture speaking here, I don't think I've ever seen anybody do that. I think if I came and saw one of you on the ground with your clothes torn and crying and ashes and all this kind of stuff, I would say, I don't think they're coping very well. But Job shows us something here. He suffers with pain and with persistence. He doesn't try to pretend the pain away. He doesn't try to play games as if, oh, that didn't really hurt. I'm doing okay, stiff upper lip, I've got this. He really, really is hurt by what has come into his life. You see, there are basically three ways that people process suffering, process pain when it comes into their lives. You have the confident people that just want to soar above all the pain. And the idea is, if I just have a good enough relationship with God, if I do all the right things, check all the right boxes, if I'm moral enough and godly enough, God's going to give me this great life, the blessed life. And I'm going to just soar over all the suffering of life. And it's going to be wonderful. It's going to be awesome. Or, there's even the secular brand of this that says, if I really build a great career and I save up a lot in the bank account, if I move to the right neighborhood, I can avoid all the pain that I've seen in my family and seen with other people in this world. I can avoid and dodge the suffering by sheer grit, by willpower. There's also the cavalier who basically go into suffering and see that as a badge of honor. I walked uphill both ways to school in the snow. I see I was able to grit it out. I was able to grin and bear it. I got through it. And there's that cavalier approach. The confident are basically Job's friends. And it begins to kind of rub off on him toward the end of the book, is a sense of like, well, if you're living the blessed life, you should be able to hop over this. The cavalier, Job definitely knocks that in the teeth. Job is not cavalier about this situation. He is weeping on the floor. And then there are the crushed, the people who go into suffering and it defines them and it destroys them. The people that spiral into self-pity, self-loathing. The people who lash out and take it out on other people around them. The people who lash it out and take it out on God. But you see Job's posture. He says, throughout all this, verse 22, Job did not sin or blame God for anything. Job functions without the pointed fingers of the crushed. He functions without the stiff upper lip of the cavalier. And he is the morally superior guy who goes through suffering. What is this? He's able to deal with suffering in a way that transcends and doesn't look like anything our culture has to offer. Why is that? I think verse 21 actually gives us some perspective here. Verse 21, he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will leave this life. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. He's basically saying this. I understand, I know that everything good in this life is a gift from God. Number one, I know that. I have no doubt about it. This world of suffering, I should not be receiving anything good. So everything good that I had, the stuff, the house, the kids, all of that, God's gift of grace in my life. And then number two, I know that eventually everything that God has given me in this life will be gone. I know that. And so therefore I know that I ought to thank God. I ought to bless him for every little bit of goodness that has come into my life. In a sense, and I was reflecting on this after coming back from Chris Carson's dad's memorial service. Have you thought about this? That you and I will one day all walk the path of Job? There will come a day in every one of our lives where the people who meant the most to us will no longer be there. Where the stuff that we have invested our lives chasing after will get handed over to someone else. Where even the bonds of family break apart. That moment is the moment that falls on all of humanity, all of Adam's children, cursed with death. The grave takes all those things from us at some point or another. And here Job is, the walking dead, seeing it before the grave. Job has the perspective to see what we hide from ourselves, the truth that we want to ignore, the stuff we want to pretend away as if it doesn't exist. We live our lives trying to ignore this possibility that that's going to happen to us, that all these things are going to slip through our fingers one day. Job sees it while he's still alive. And as a result, he has this perspective that says, oh, I'm going to bless God for every single thing that he put into my life that's been good. Bless him while I'm living, not just after I'm gone. He sees with fresh eyes what we hide from ourselves, that you can have an eternal perspective on blessing and on loss that gives you hope instead of grief in times of suffering. And lastly, I'll leave you with this. I love how this passage ends chapter 1, transitions into chapter 2. He says, throughout all this, Job did not sin or blame God for anything. That verse is legal language. He didn't put a charge against God. He didn't press charges against God. He didn't bring God into court. He didn't interrogate God. He lets God off scot-free in this situation and accepts the pointed finger of blame at his own chest. An undeserved sufferer receives the pointed finger of blame at himself. And what does that remind you of? The book of Job ultimately points us forward to the one, Jesus Christ, who comes into this world not deserving any form of suffering. In fact, he is even far more righteous than Job. He lives a completely perfect and upright life, a completely righteous life before the eyes of God, and comes under unmerited, unexplained, unfair suffering, comes into his heart, comes into his life, and he dies as a result of that. He takes the pointed finger of blame, pointed at his chest. He takes the verdict of guilty on his back so that we may be declared not guilty. He takes the blame so you and I get off the hook. That's functionally what Job is pointing us to, is a greater and fuller Job who completes the story for all of us. That we get to experience the freedom from the consequences of evil. Yes, even the evil that we have participated in unleashing on this world can all be undone through the righteous sufferer who can do it in the place of us. And so as you read the book of Job, as we explore this together, May that stick with you as you process and work through the unexplained suffering that enters into your life. Let's pray. Oh God, we thank you. Thank you for this beautiful, powerful story, this very unusual story that shows us how you engage with the suffering of our life, that you are not distant. There is not anything that has come into our lives that doesn't flow through your hands. You're not out of control. This world is not spiraling out of your hands. But yet you are restraining so much of the suffering that would naturally come in. So we give you praise for that. We give you praise for all of the goodness that comes into our lives, undeserved, as much as we feel the undeserved suffering that also comes in. Lord, I thank you for that hope that comes in the gospel, that you took the suffering you did not deserve, so that those of us who deserve to suffer could be free. I pray that if there are any here this morning who do not know what that means, who have not experienced your grace and your freedom and your forgiveness, would this morning respond, would go grab a friend, grab a pastor, and pray to receive your grace this morning. We thank you that you are enough.